For nearly 2 centuries, the Southwest has been explored for a variety of reasons. Some were seeking wealth from the riches of gold, while others were in search of land on which to build their lives. While explorers like John Wesley Powell were in search of scientific discovery. In order to document his findings, he turned to the realm of photography. In 1869, Major John Wesley Powell set out to explore the Colorado and Green Rivers. At that point in time, there were great expanses of the American West and Southwest that were virtually unexplored. Powell was determined to undertake the first, hopefully scientific exploration of the Colorado Plateau. He wanted to collect data about the topography and geology. Powell was the only scientist, and the trip turned out to be one of survival only. Powell attempted another expedition in 1871 to 1872. This trip included other scientists, topographers, geologists, engineers, and a photographer by the name of E.O. Beeman.
E.O. Beeman was a professional photographer that John Wesley Powell engaged for the trip, and he took the pictures that were on the first part of the trip from Green River, Wyoming, down the Green River to its confluence with the Colorado, and down the Colorado through Glen Canyon to Lee's Ferry. There was an actual ferry there, and that's where the party left the river for a wintering in Kanab, Utah. Beeman had some dissatisfaction with the trip. He and Powell did not strike it off too well, and Powell, who supplied most of the photographic equipment, did buy what remained of the photographic supplies from Beeman and let him go. At this point, James Fenimore joined the party for the period in the vicinity of Lee's Ferry and somewhat downstream on the Colorado. But ill health forced him to leave after a very few months. But during this time, he trained a boatman or general roustabout by the name of Jack Hillers, who became an excellent photographer. And then later, after the Powell expedition, became an official photographer for the U.S. Geological Survey, and made trips back in later years to photograph some of the high plateau country.
The photo equipment used was the state-of-the-art in the 1870s. They used large glass plate cameras. One was 11 by 14 in size, while the one they used most often was 5 by 8, which took stereo pair photos, each 4 by 5 in size. The photographic plates required the wet plate process, which had to be prepared in the field while inside a darkroom tent and exposed immediately. The cameras, tripod, darkroom equipment, and darkroom tent was very bulky and weighed several hundred pounds. This equipment was carried along with them in the boats. The outcome of Powell's expedition was of discovery. Maps, geologic, and geographic data were produced. Approximately 100 years later, in 1968, plans were underway to celebrate the John Wesley Powell Centennial. This was begun by Dr. Eugene Shoemaker.
Eugene Shoemaker, who incidentally established the Flagstaff Field Center of Astrogeology, thought it would be a great idea to retrace Powell's voyage. He had developed an interest in running the river and naturally fell into reading about early exploration, and Powell was the first to make the trip and record the scientific data that he was able to on the second expedition in 1871 and 72.
A 3-month expedition was supported by the United States Geological Survey. The plan was to relocate and rephotograph the scenes from Beeman's and Hiller's original camera stations, in addition to doing some geologic studies. The crew of this commemorating expedition were members of the USGS, veteran river runners, and some students from Caltech. The only photographer on this journey was Hal G. Stephens, who was part of the USGS since 1942. Mr. Stephens' original involvement with photography came about while he was in the Army Air Corps, now known as the Air Force. He began with the processing of aerial photographs used in the preparation of maps. However, his primary involvement with photography was through self-education. Not only did he study on his own, but he discussed photography techniques with many other photographers. While photographing with the USGS on this commemorating expedition, his procedure and equipment differed from what Powell's team had used.
I used a Graflex modular camera, which is not available today, but it would have at least two boxes or backs for the camera, different lenses that could be used in combination with that. One interesting thing was that I started off with a camera system that had a standard focal length lens, say 80 millimeters for a 2¼ 3¼ format. We had just begun taking photographs, and I had difficulty covering the scene with that setup. On one excursion in Lador Canyon, I was climbing a very steep, rocky pitch. I lost my footing, I fell over backward, and I broke this camera. I resorted then to a different back, and the only other lens was an extremely wide-angle lens, a 47 millimeter super-angulon lens. This one happened to be exactly the proper coverage of the film area, corresponding to the one that the E.O. Beeman used.
Finding the camera sites of Beeman's and Hiller's was a combined effort which ranged from the obvious to slightly complex.
We first, of course, had to locate these particular camera stations. We were able to locate them by two means. One was we had album prints, 4x5 prints, that we obtained from the Denver library of the U.S. Geological Survey. And we carried those on our trip. We could look at them and compare them with the profiles of the canyon walls and the canyon itself. Gene Shoemaker was so intimately familiar with the geology and topography of the Colorado Plateau area and the Grand Canyon in particular, that he was able to recognize these very quickly. And because of his expertise, we were able to find camera sites in a matter of minutes. Some were very difficult to locate. There had been changes such as rock falls, flash floods, and so forth that made it a little more difficult. The longest time we spent searching for a camera site was about 2 hours.
For one particular photograph, the team did a bit of repositioning.
Green River Canyon below Flaming Gorge Dam, there was one site that showed prominently a log resting on a boulder in the foreground. When we found that site and occupied that, we thought, wouldn't it be nice to see if that log is still there? We searched around on the riverbank, and 20 feet high up on the riverbank, we found that log. And it was very characteristic in shape, so we placed it on that same boulder and rephotographed the scene. And we left it there. And it was even found there by other people who made the trip later. So it may still be there.
Following the Centennial Expedition, Hal Stephens, along with Dr. Eugene Shoemaker, wanted to chronicle the efforts of the John Wesley Powell photographers Beeman and Hillers. At the same time, they wished to record the geologic changes which took place during the 100-year interval. What resulted was a book which provided a detailed description of the geologic formations viewed from each camera site.
In 1977, or just prior to that, just prior to my retirement, Gene Shoemaker and Dr. Henry W. Toll, Jr., who was president of the Powell Society in Denver, came to me and asked if I would undertake the preparation and writing of a book that the Powell Society would be willing to publish or co-publish that book.
Immediately, Mr. Stephens began writing, and a first draft was completed in about 4 months. Prior to the conceptualized book, there was a team which worked on the enhancing of the Powell photographs. About 4 men worked for several weeks, putting in over 1,000 hours of overtime.
We received 4x5 positives, copies that the National Archives made off the plates. We could not borrow the plates. They would not let them out. We took the 4x5 positives and made 8x10 copy negatives of those. The copy negatives were retouched, particularly for white spots and cracks and so forth. Then when the retouching was completed on that, they were printed on 11x14 paper, and those prints were then retouched. So we were able to retouch both the opaque areas that needed it and the clear areas by having the positive and the negative. The 11x14s were then copied onto 4x5 negatives and printed on 8x10. That is several generations, but each one seemed necessary to produce a good product. Those 8x10 prints then, the final prints, were used for the publication.
In the Footsteps of John Wesley Powell was finally published in 1987. Now looking back on the expedition dealing with photography, Mr. Stephens felt that perhaps some changes would have helped to make the photography run smoother.
We always deal with the current state of the art. The cameras back then I thought were rather sophisticated, but they weren't. I had to determine my own exposures. I had to focus manually. This all requires time. Some pictures, some photographs do not permit a lot of time in their taking. I recall one scene on the Yampa River where the sun was fading fast. The picture I took was about 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the evening, and it required a fairly long exposure. But we would never get back to that point, so I had to use whatever I had at hand. The time required was a prime factor. With automatic focus and automatic exposure, which are current day technical advances, that would be a great improvement.
Not only have photography procedures and equipment changed in the few decades since the commemorating expedition, but Mr. Stephens has witnessed his own impact on USGS photography.
My career has been in geology. Photography, being a serious interest of mine, was utilized in geologic subjects, geologic investigations. I did photography you might say specifically directed to geological themes, photographs of different types of rocks, photographs of outcrops, photographs of various exposures, photographs through the microscope, photographs of extremely small particles. There wasn't an awful lot done in the field. I like to think that I stimulated quite a bit of photography in the field. Many of the geologists that I was associated with needed photographs to illustrate their professional papers. The photographs that they used were often quite inferior, simply because they were not particularly interested in photography and weren't able to get what they should have. I think that the use of comparative photographs that we used on the PAL expedition did stimulate this type of recording of scenes by other scientists, not necessarily in geology. They may be studying vegetation or landforms or alluvial deposition, various things that do change possibly in a short period of time. I've seen reports since the book where they've used this technique, and it can be very useful. There's one geologist I know that has borrowed many of my prints and negatives, who is doing a study in the Grand Canyon, similar to mine, but much more detailed and extensive. He has obtained photographs from every expedition practically that's gone down the canyon, starting back around after Powell's voyage, perhaps 1890, the Staunton expedition, for example. And he's making great use of the method of comparative photographs. And what he's doing, he's taking some of the early photographs around Powell's time and a little later, and then taking mine, which are now 30 years old, and photographing the same sites currently, which makes them 30 years later than mine. And he finds that in studying old beach deposits and features such as these, that they're very useful. It's a good way of recording. It's much better than a graphic description of these scenes.
After talking with Hal Stephens about the expedition and book commemorating John Wesley Powell's efforts, I asked him if he had any advice or helpful information to future photographers. This is what he had to say.
A person really should not start off with a camera. He should examine the subject matter that he's interested in or wants to record and study it and think about how he would concentrate on the principal subject, how he would frame the area that he wanted to record, not get too far away from the subject. So many people will take a picture, say, of a person, and you not only can't recognize the person, you can hardly see that it's a human being. They're too far away. The camera is just a tool. It's not an end in itself. So many people get so excited and wrapped up in the gadgetry that having a camera provides. They talk about the lenses that they've got, they talk about the film that they use, but they don't talk about the subject matter. And I think that's the primary purpose of taking photographs. An artist makes an excellent photographer because they study the scene, they study the subject. They can move the subject to illustrate what they want to show. An artist, of course, can take license and move objects around or eliminate them from a canvas, whereas the photographer has to either take what's in the scene or, if it's possible, to manipulate it, fine. Learn the craft, learn the technical details, but it is only for supporting their primary effort, communicate.
Just like the photographers Beeman and Hillers on the John Wesley Powell expedition, Hal Stephens successfully communicated in the scientific world through photography. Today, Mr. Stephens resides in Flagstaff, Arizona, where he continues to study and explore photography on his own, ranging from color photos of the beautiful San Francisco peaks to seeking the possibilities in digital photography.